Well, now that Congress has averted a shutdown, the focus turns to the longer-term fiscal deficit. As we heard from Peter, President Obama expected to lay out his plans to tackle the nation's debt on Wednesday. For more, we are joined by the Dean of Columbia Business School and also the former chairman of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, Glenn Hubbard. Great to have you back with us, Dean Hubbard.
Thanks, pleasure.
Okay, so we're expecting to hear this layout from the president on Wednesday about cuts, tax increases, cuts to Medicare, Social Security, and so forth. Is it too late, though, in his presidency to get the bipartisan support for this?
I don't think it's too late. I certainly commend the president for weighing in. We'll have to see what he says. The idea of raising marginal tax rates at the present time would strike me as a very bad idea. But the notion of framing spending cuts and to force those cuts really to affect the most well-off among us is definitely the right thing to do. That, of course, is what Congressman Ryan proposed.
Right, so that could be perhaps grounds for some common ground between the two. What do you want to hear, though, from the president to see that whether or not that these cuts or that his plan is viable?
Well, I think what we all need to hear from the president is really two things. The first is leadership, and the second is principles. This is the first time the president has indicated spending cuts are important. That's a good thing, although he's late to the party. The second is what the principles are, and I hope those include we need a growing economy for our living standards, and we need to force cuts really on the spending side, but have them appeal to the most well-off among us. That is, have the well-to-do pay the burden of the spending cuts. If he does those things, I think there's a lot of common ground.
You mentioned the Ryan plan, which was unveiled last week. What do you like and what don't you like about that plan?
Well, I think first and foremost, Congressman Ryan has done the nation a favor by teeing up the problem. The problem really is runaway entitlement spending, as it has been for years. I think that probably more could be done to tell the American people how big the problem is before going to solutions, and also discussing Social Security, which is not in the Ryan plan. But I think Congressman Ryan deserves all of our praise for teeing up really the central domestic issue of our day.
Well, Social Security, I think, is a very key issue for both the Democrats and the Republicans. What needs to be done on Social Security?
Well, we have large deficits in Social Security, and it's important to fix them in a way that shores up the problem and the program. And to my mind, it's pretty simple. We need to strengthen minimum benefits for the least well-off among us. We need to avoid increasing the payroll tax, and we need to slow down the rate of growth of benefits for upper-income households. If we do these things, we can shore up Social Security and make it stronger than today. Doing nothing will kill the program.
Okay. Dean Hubbard, let me just read for you. Paul Krugman came out with with his usual editorial in the New York Times, talking about the GOP plan and some of the plans for the tax cuts. And what he essentially says is that, this Ryan plan, which includes $3 trillion in tax cuts over the next decade, put forth by the GOP, says there's no viable way to make them revenue neutral. He says, quote, even completely eliminating one of the biggest exemptions, the mortgage interest deduction, wouldn't come close. And GOP leaders have not, of course, called for anything that drastic. I haven't seen them name any significant exemptions that they would end. Basically, he's saying that there's no way that there could be any tax cuts that would not affect, that would be revenue neutral. Are the Republicans going to have to give up some of these tax cuts?
Well, I think what Congressman Ryan was saying, which is in effect what the Bowles-Simpson Commission appointed by President Obama said, if we're willing to broaden the base, we can lower the rates. I think these are more blueprints for the American people to think about. I would hope the immediate action really focuses on the spending side. But yes, tax reform is an important subject, and I don't see that much difference, frankly, between what Congressman Ryan is teeing up and what Bowles and Simpson teed up.
Dean Hubbard, would it have been better to have a government shutdown to focus the nation on cutting spending then?
I don't think so. I think the American people look to their leaders to solve problems. And if we can't even fix a near-term budget, how could we possibly deal with the long-term problems? I think it's a matter of President Obama leading, which he may now do with his initial budget foray. And I think the Republicans need to give him the opening for that conversation. That's what we all want.
Okay, Glenn Hubbard. Glenn, the fact that, to be realistic, I mean, there are huge divides, right, in Washington. And as Mike is saying, there's even a huge divide in the private world with economists. I mean, what are the chances that essentially we'll just continue to drift here?
Well, I think we have to break the problem up into two pieces, and I actually don't think there's as much disagreement among economists. What Mike was doing is mixing two discussions, cuts today versus changing the trajectory of fiscal policy. I don't think very many economists believe that it's not a good idea to do the latter and that it would be pro-growth to do so. So really, in the present time, rather than fighting so much just over this year's budget, let's turn our eye to the future. That's why I'm optimistic that President Obama's foray could really help this discussion.
You think, Glenn, that if he proposes Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, it takes those issues off the third rail of politics and both sides can have a discussion?
Well, I think it's important. You know, the president really needs to lead on this. This is the first time he's had a serious conversation, and I think we ought to see what he has to say. I do believe it could really help take them off the third rail, and it's very, very important.
You know, Glenn, I understand what your point about how, we seem to be mixing some of the cuts today with what we need to do in the future, longer term. But don't you think that that's even just apparent, this mixing of time apparent in when we're talking about the debt ceiling?
Well, the debt ceiling, of course, is not an issue that economists would say ought to even be front and center. This is a political issue. Of course we should pay our debts. The issue is whether, as Ken Rogoff said in your clip, it makes sense to keep piling up more debts. That's what's so unfortunate. Of course we should raise the debt ceiling, but what we really need to do is get budget reforms in place to stop the Congress and the president from piling up more and more and more debt.
Rogoff says you've got to get under 90%. Is the U.S. a special case? Do you think we can go over that?
Well, we don't really know. We're the reserve currency country, of course, but
okay.
I don't see the need to play...
Dean Hubbard, just hang on one second. We'll let you answer that right after the break. Get back to Dean Hubbard. I want to make sure that he had a chance to answer the question that Mike was proposing to him, which is essentially, does the U.S. hold a special position, which, perhaps lets it a little bit off the hook when we talk about its debt to GDP. Dean Hubbard, finish your thought, please.
Well, I don't think we have a unique position. We may be able to have a little give, but we need to get the debt to GDP ratio down steadily, and it's not hard to do. We just need to change the entitlement trajectory, but we must do it.
Okay. All right. Glenn Hubbard, thank you for joining
Pleasure.
us and for sticking around. I really appreciate it. The Dean of Columbia Business School and also the former chairman of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors.